Hello, everyone. Welcome to our introduction to coding. My name is Ty Tomasi. I'm the Director of Accessibility, Belonging, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity here at APH. And this class came about because we got some feedback from some individuals that certain mainstream coding services did not have enough accessibility for them. So they wanted to know how to deal with some of the challenges they were facing in coding. So today with us, we have Florian Beijers, who's going to teach us a little bit about coding, an intro to software development. Florian, take it away.
I shall do that. And good, well done on the name. Was very close.
Thanks.
Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. Also, I'm stoked by the amount of people that signed up for this, and I really hope that I'll be able to help you get the most out of this class. And yeah, that's what I'm hoping to be doing in the next several sessions. Now, the class is called Intro to Software Development and Coding Obstacles or anything of that sort. And that really is a very good nomer because I'm going to teach you how to code, sure, but that's not my main goal. My main goal is I'm going to teach you how to learn how to code. And those are two very subtly different things. As Ty said, there's a lot of problems with mainstream resources, like knowing how to best make use of them and just knowing how to get the tooling right to sort of give you a good start in software development and coding and programming and all these other synonyms that are slightly different and they're really great for like starting a forest fire in the middle of dinner when you have like a bunch of developers at the same table. Couple admin things. So this is going to be the first session. Like there was a preparatory email that was sent out a couple of days ago on Friday and then again on yesterday that had a couple of things for you guys to do. Like most of it was like installing Git, which is an infuriatingly long installer. I am with you. I hope you guys didn't pull your hair out, but yeah, that was the main thing. And then maybe looked at the pages that these two tools we looked at the Visual Studio Code page and we looked at the GitHub page or the Git page rather. And yeah, there's a couple of things we want to cover with those today because all these things seemingly have nothing to do with each other and then suddenly they do. And it can be a little tricky to figure out how all that works. So there's going to be some demos. There's going to be some stuff that I will show off that you guys can do, well, with me if you want, or you can do it afterwards and then just get comfy with it in your own time. We're going to install a few things and we're going to just look at a number of concepts, both like pragmatic as well as more abstract, as it were. A couple of things. The Slido or Slido, I actually don't know how that's pronounced. The URL is sly.do, so maybe even Slido. I have no idea. It's a tool that someone recommended to me for audience participation. That's not really what I'm using it for. It's more for like questions outside of class. The big disadvantage of Slido being that you can't see when someone's responded to your question, and I can't see when questions come in. So there may be a bit of lag between you asking a question and getting an answer. It's not instant messaging. Now, there's almost 200 plus of you, so instant messaging would probably drive me completely insane. But just be aware that there is no mechanism for like notifications for this. So if you put in a question, like just check again a couple of hours later. I usually get to these pretty quickly because I tend to check them reasonably often, but it can always happen that it takes me a little while for me to get to them. Obviously, I have to work too. I have to make money. So in that sense, I may not always be able to look at the thing for a while. Now, you guys mostly are in the lucky position that you're behind me time zone wise. So while I'm working, you guys are snoozing. And then when you're waking up, I usually am done with my workday. So when you start doing stuff, I should be around to answer questions. Now, I understand that this may not be ideal for people. And 7 of you found the hidden Easter egg that I didn't actually advertise, but I put a poll on the Slido about what we're going to use for outside of class, like out of band communication. So far, most of you prefer Slido, and you're fine with that. Obviously, if we're doing something else, if we're doing a Discord or a Telegram group, the problem there is that we're going to have to self-police it because I will not have time to moderate it. So that is the big caveat, and it does mean that you'll have to essentially walk into the wild west of unmoderated communication, which may or may not be something you want to do. So you guys can vote on that poll. It's in the Slido under the polls tab. And then if you want to use something else really badly, we'll take it into consideration. For now, though, let's stick to the Slido. It seems to have worked. I've gotten a couple of your questions answered, and some of those will feature actually here in the class in just a minute. But yeah, so far it's been going well. I'm a little worried about the fact that there may be very different topics, and there's no real way to split those into categories, as it were. So it might get a little chaotic, but we'll just wing it as it goes. Now, as for lost my train of thought there. Doesn't matter. Yeah, that's about Slido. We're going to be covering several things. We're going to cover the command line a little bit, because what it is, Git essentially requires you to know at least a little bit about the command line in order to get anywhere. And it's always been portrayed as this scary thing that people don't really know how to use, and it will break your computer. It's not going to be that bad. We're going to talk a bit about GitHub. We're going to talk a bit about installing VS Code and Python, because they both have a bit of a gotcha to know about before you install those willy-nilly. And then I might do some live coding towards the end. If I do that, if I get to that, I'm not sure if I'll have enough time. But if I get to that, the code will be shared with you, and your homework will be to sort of puzzle it out. And you're going to see what it does. I'm going to run it for you in class, but you're going to see, like, figure out what each line does, and like give me your best theories. Like, it's going to be your homework. If we don't get to that, I'll think of something else. But there will be times for questions. What I generally expect you advise you to do is to either raise your hand when you have a question, and then lower it again if I answer it in the meantime, because I'm not going to be able to get to all your questions right away. The best way to essentially do it is, particularly if you have trouble keeping things in mind while someone's talking at you, write the question down, raise your hand, and then reevaluate once there's an initial question moment where I address questions. We have a wonderful host here in the chat that's going to keep an eye on the chat. I will, when I share my screen, hear them in the speech as well. So at that point, it may not be necessary, but if we're doing questions and I'm talking, it's just easier if someone else is going to field them to me. So in that sense, there may be times where I'll let you speak. There may be times where we'll just do it over chat. It depends on the deluge of questions that I expect to happen or not. Yeah, that sounds like it's a good start. Couple of questions that you guys had in class already, like before we started. Is this only for Windows? Kinda. I do know enough about macOS to help you guys along if you're on that platform. The tools we're going to be covering are generally the same across OSs, so it doesn't really matter. You could even be on Ubuntu if you want to do that, and that's going to be fine. You'll be pretty more used to the command line as the other people here, but yeah, that's fine. JAWS versus NVDA. I myself use NVDA. I do know JAWS well enough to talk about it. I don't currently have it installed because I had to wipe my computer, but if I do have to show off JAWS-specific things, I will make sure there is a JAWS copy on my system so I can show it off in JAWS. Again, generally, the things work the exact same way. The hotkeys may be different, the terminology may be different, but I will point that out as we go. Okay. The recordings. So essentially, there's going to be a YouTube channel from APH. They have a playlist that is going to have the videos. Generally, what I will do is I will put the code that we used this week. There may not be any this week, but like that we used this session. I will put a link to that in the video description, and I may or may not share it out using Slido. Depends on how much of it is and how urgent it is for you to have it like before the video goes up. This may or may not be a problem. I don't know yet. We'll have to see. It depends on how fast we can go through the material and how many questions there generally are. So what to expect from this course? There's going to be coding. There's going to be coding for sure. We're going to be covering HTML. We're going to be covering Python. But what we're mostly going to also be covering is the tools and the ecosystem around learning how to code. So we're going to learn how to learn. And I don't mean that in a Dr. Phil kind of way. I mean that in a what tools work, what tools don't work, what workarounds will you need to get some tools to work, that kind of thing. Because I could teach you how to do Hello World in Python, and I probably will do that. But there's also a whole bunch of other people who can do that way better than me. And I definitely encourage you to do your own research to find out what you can find and how far you can get, and I'll happily answer your questions. You don't have to do that. It will be covered in class. We'll be covering programming basics, not in this session, but certainly in the sessions following. But yeah, we'll also be covering the tools. We'll be covering the tools that developers in the field use, and we'll do that because that's often the problem when you apply for a job. It's going to be a lot of like, we use so-and-so tool. Can you work with this tool? Or we're gonna have to make you do a programming test. Can you do the programming test? And even before that, this essentially that I shouldn't have thrown my speech on. That got me distracted. My bad. This is often a problem with, for example, issue tracking tools or code repositories, which is something we'll go into in a little bit. So these are things that we'll be covering as we go along. And GitHub and Visual Studio Code are central pillars of our curriculum for this course. And there's a number of reasons for that. Visual Studio Code is essentially an editor that tries to do it all and is reasonably successful at it. So it doesn't really matter what programming language you're using. But there are other editors, of course. You can use Notepad++, you can use other ones, and Visual Studio Code seems to hit that sweet spot between what it can do and what you would want to use it for reasonably well. And it's certainly not the Swiss Army knife that it is for sighted developers in some respects. Like, there are still extensions that are not accessible. There are portions of the UI that could be more accessible. So we're not going to be using it for everything. We're going to try to use it for as many things as we possibly can, so you can do essentially what your prospective sighted developer colleagues will do. And if you have that same shared vocabulary and that same shared tool set, it helps a lot in both getting a foot in the door and keeping there, like essentially just being part of the team and not being the special person that needs all the different tools. I myself have been doing development for sighted teams for about 5 years now, and this has led to various interesting things. The Visual Studio Code was not super accessible to begin with. Like, when it first came out, it was very inaccessible. It didn't work at all. And I was asked to test the product because I was at the time interning for Microsoft. And well, I essentially gave them a piece of my mind and told them that it was essentially terrible and could not be used. And they've really taken that feedback to heart. And what I like about VS Code is that they've kept doing that. And they've essentially they've bred a very open, communicative culture of filing issues on GitHub, and usually they'll get heard pretty quickly and they'll get fixed, or at least someone will look at it. Again, not in every aspect. It's not a use it for everything tool, but it certainly comes very close. I use it as both a code editor as well as a note-taking solution. There's an extension called Dendron, Dendron, which is very nice for hierarchical note-taking, which is based on VS Code. The Arduino IDE, which is a tool for programming microboards based on the Arduino spec, is also based on VS Code now. At least that's, well, it's hard to see. It's sort of like 5 layers of paint on an already existing door, but it's certainly visible, and it's way more accessible than it used to be. So that this tool exists and that it's so modular that it can be used to either base or amplify and like alter existing solutions is really great. And that's one of the reasons we're going to be working with it. That is pretty much all the adminning done. Are there questions that I can answer at this point? Like I'm gonna give it a couple of minutes to answer some questions here.
While we wait for questions, I'm just going to break in here briefly and say thank you so much to our sponsor, CDW, for their generous sponsorship of this class. We wouldn't be able to do this work without them.
There was one question in the chat. I'm curious about how much this will apply to remote access to Linux servers. I assume that most of the tools will be the same, but I've run into issues using VS Code as a terminal, basically saying that there's too much output to announce.
VS Code is absolutely something you can use for remote development. As in fact, that's what I do every day. I have a really convoluted setup currently where I am essentially using 3 computers at once. And it can be used for coding that way. I would not in good conscience recommend it as a terminal alternative. And here's why. Essentially, the terminal does work, kinda. And you can do like small things with it, but it's not pleasant to work with it at the moment. This is being worked on as we speak, but it's not a very nice experience yet. So what I will generally do, and this is where like not doing everything in one program comes in, is have an SSH window next to my Visual Studio Code instance that I do my terminal stuff with. So if I need to run a piece of Python, I will do that from the SSH window, not from VS Code.
One more, how powerful is Notepad for coding?
Notepad or Notepad++?
And then we have one hand raised, Notepad.
Okay, so Notepad can be used for coding in the way that a physical notebook can be used to write a novel in. You can do it. It's absolutely possible. I just wouldn't recommend it for larger projects.
We have 2 hands. One is Anissa. Anissa, I've allowed your mic.
Yeah, go ahead and ask.
Alt A is the keystroke command, or you can hold down the space bar.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question has to do with how advanced the machine needs to be to do all the recommended installations. My current computer can only support Windows 7, and I don't want to break it down by installing things that are too heavy for that machine. Is there any problem or?
That is a good question. Generally, we will not be doing anything that should be too heavy for a Windows 7 machine. It's more dependent on the specifications rather than the actual OS that it runs. But you may encounter sluggishness in VS Code when doing certain things. So it shouldn't break anything, though.
Thanks.
Yep. I think we had one other raised hand.
You do. Evan, I've turned on your mic, so you're able to ask a question.
Yes, I wanted to know if this class will be recorded on that YouTube page. I think I missed it in the beginning.
Yeah, I'll repeat that. Essentially, there will be videos on the APH YouTube channel in their own playlist. And generally, the descriptions of those videos will have links to either handouts or stuff that was covered in class or other things. Right after we're done with this class, I'll prepare a video description for this video. And then once I've done that, once YouTube has processed everything, it'll be visible there.
Okay, thank you.
And one more question. Someone has emailed saying that they use a Chromebook and they don't think that Git is compatible. Can you address that? Is that something they can use on a Chromebook?
At that point, you're pushing it. It can be done. you can run Linux tools on a Chromebook. That is not something I personally know very much about, but it can be done. You can run Linux tools on your Chromebook, and Git should be able to be ran in that mode. But honestly, that's far outside the scope of what I'm comfortable teaching you. Google it. You have a Chromebook, Google it.
Another question, I don't have any experience with programming. Is this a class something I can do as a beginner?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm expecting no experience whatsoever in anything but the requirements that were on the page. So I expect you to know your screen reader. I expect you to know your computer well enough to do somewhat advanced tasks like installing software, using things like the object navigator in Nvda or the JAWS cursor, things like that. So if that's something you're having trouble with, I recommend reading up on those, but you do not need to know programming to do this class. The whole point is that you don't know that yet. So like I said in my preparatory instructions for this first class, I told you to go read these pages. I didn't expect you to understand any of that. So no, you're completely fine.
We have a few more hands. Do you want to move forward and wait, or do you want to answer?
We can do one more for now.
Okay, Jasmine was the next one. So Jasmine.
Hello, I'm wondering, I believe I do have Notepad installed on my computer, but should I be using Notepad++, or is there any huge differences that I need to worry about on that?
Okay, so we're not going to be doing much coding in this first session. And one of the things we're going to cover today is actually installing Visual Studio Code. So you're fine. And I would recommend using that from next week onward. Next week is a big deep dive into Visual Studio Code. Hamid, I saw your question about the extensions. We'll be covering that then as well.
Okay. Thank you.
For now, you can just use Notepad. If we're doing any coding, you can use Notepad or any editor you feel comfortable with. That does plain text. You don't want to use Word for this. That's going to cause a lot of problems.
So I put Notepad, just regular Notepad as my
Git editor.
The editor inside Git. So
that's fine.
I need to change that, can I or no?
You can change it with a command. Yeah.
Okay.
You don't need to do that at the moment, but you can absolutely change it if you need to.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, I'm going to move on for now. If you have questions that are really tricky, you can put them in a Slido after class, or maybe I'll cover them in like the next hour. In which case, well, question answered. So yeah, there we go. The first thing we're going to be covering is something that is tangentially related to coding, but maybe not obviously so. And that is a service called GitHub, and it's, well, essentially linchpin Git. Git is the thing I told you to install, and this is going to be a bit of a chain reaction, because to understand GitHub, we need to understand Git, and to understand Git, we need to understand the command line a little bit. So we're going to do that. Essentially, we're going to cover those one by one. So first command line, then Git, then GitHub. And then once I've done all that, we can see how much time there's left. And there's definitely going to be a bunch of questions that I do want to get to, because these are very fundamental topics that we'll be coming back to over and over and over again. So I will start with these, and there'll be a little bit of room for questions in between these three topics. So I'll be pausing a little bit after the command line. I'll be pausing a little bit after Git, and I'll be pausing a little bit after GitHub. And for this, I think I am going to share my screen so you can hear my screen reader, because I'm going to be showing off a couple things. So I will make sure that my eloquence is not too fast for the people who have it at a slow rate. And I will talk over myself while I find the button to share my screen. There it is.
If you want us to hear the sound, don't forget to check the 2 little boxes that say share sound.
Having a slight problem there. Okay, it's bumping me straight into the advanced sharing options and not letting me share because it's asking me who can share. Can I quickly fix that?
You should be able to. It should push you right into basic. You did Alt S.
Ah, now it works. Okay.
Okay.
Interesting. Share sound. Doesn't even matter what window I share because, well, okay.
Meeting controls window.
You should be hearing
live transcription. Closed captioning has been enabled. Press F6 for more information about Lucas.
Correct.
We are. I will tell you one thing about any voiceover component. When it speaks, we won't hear you.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I will make sure to keep an eye on that. So one thing I will teach you that maybe you haven't seen before is the run dialog, which you can access with Windows key plus R. On the Mac, this would be analogous to Spotlight, which is Command Space. And on Linux, you'd probably use the GNOME launcher, which is Alt F2. But we're doing Windows, so we're doing Windows R.
Run dialog, open, combo box select,
and this is a kind of command line because it is a command line that lets us type application names, and how that exactly works is beyond the scope of this, but it's a really quick way to get to applications or folders. In this case, what we want to do is use the command CMD, and CMD stands for command. On the Mac, you'd want terminal, and on GNOME, you'd also want terminal. So we're opening CMD.
Text on C, Windows System 32 CMD.x terminal blank, Microsoft Windows version 10.0.1904.2.15.
And it's going to throw a whole bunch of output at you. And right now we have gone back to the 80s because what we're seeing is essentially a black screen with white letters on it. That may have gone through a couple of like fanciful iterations over the last 30 or so years, but the idea is still very similar. And it may reminisce people who have played MUDs before, because this is a very similar system. You type commands and it returns output to you. And the way that works is when you type a command into
to everyone. Sarah, personal email is
I'm going to like mute my speech so chats don't get double spoken for people.
Speech mode off.
Essentially, when we're on the command line, what we're invoking are commands, and commands really are just programs. So when you type a command, the computer looks into what are known as paths in the path environment variable, which all sounds super geeky, but just means that there is a place stored in memory where there's a number of lists, like number of folders that says, hey, if someone types a command, look in one of these folders to see if there is like an executable, a .exe file that responds to that name. So if you type, for example, dir, which is the Windows equivalent of ls on Mac and Linux, which is essentially a way to list all the folders and files that you're currently looking at, then you are telling a dir.exe to do its thing. And that is akin to normally double-clicking an application and then pressing a button that makes it do a certain thing, because that's the big difference. Like there is the GUI, or the graphical user interface, and then there's the CLI, or the command line interface. And what we're looking at right now is the command line. And Git, although it does have GUI front ends for it, generally is most accessible from the command line. VS Code does have facilities for Git, and we'll be going into those next week. But for now, it's the good old command line that will let us interact with our computer. And it's essentially a bit more arcane than you're probably used to. You're essentially typing incantations into the prompt, which is the bottom line here that has the, looks like this.
Speech mode top blank. See user story greater.
So there's a path, and then there's a greater sign. On Windows, that means you can type here. On the Mac and Linux, it would be a $sign. or a hashtag, which means you'd be the administrative user, in which case you're probably doing something wrong because you shouldn't be an administrative user unless you really, really have to be. But that's moving on a little fast. So command line calls programs. And when we are going to be doing Python, essentially what we're doing is we're telling the program Python to run the code that we've written. Code being essentially text. Like if you write in a programming language, you don't have to write in ones and zeros. That's not what we've been doing for a very long time now. You can if you want to, and if you're that masochistic, but you don't have to. And Python is one of hundreds of programming languages out there. For any like rhyme or reason, there is a programming language out there. Python is a very generalistic programming language. You can use it for pretty much anything, from games to data science to web application development, even mobile development. There's a library for that. And when we say Python, there is going to be a file called python.exe on your computer somewhere, and we're going to cover that in just a while. That says, okay, and then that's the command it wants to run. And then it's going to be given an argument. And an argument is essentially something you put after a command with a space in between that somehow influences that command or gives it something to work with. So if you would have Python installed and you wrote a file called hello.py, you would move your, I guess, command line focus to the folder where that folder is. That's the easiest way to do it. So say you have a folder in your home folder called programming or something. We can show that off. We just
speech mode talk.
Here, just make a folder.
mkdir space programming. C user Florian Grader.
Now, I used mkdir, which is originally a Linux command, so that's not going to work for you. I honestly don't remember the Windows equivalent of this. You won't need it yet. cd is a command you will need, and cd means change directory. So essentially, it works the same way. You do cd, and there's a program somewhere called cd.exe that responds and says, yeah, what? And then you tell it what directory to change to. And at the bottom here in the prompt, we can see that we are currently in c:\users/users/Flory, which is Microsoft's attempt at giving my profile my name and failing miserably.
To everyone. Unix equals MD. Microsoft alert.
Very good, thank you. MD for Microsoft. Yeah. There is a thing you can do in the Git installer that installs optional Unix commands to the command line. And I have gotten so used to it that I rarely need the Windows equivalents. But yes, thank you for that. I appreciate that. MD is make directory, and I can show that off. MD
programming space 2 GNIMARORT.
I'm also good at typoing.
PROGRAMMING 2 C user Florian Grader.
So, and I give off no output. No output in command line land usually means everything is okay. We just got the prompt back, which is essentially, like I said, in mod games, that would be your 20 HP, 30 mana. In this case, it's your directory that you're in. So we can now do cd
PROGRAMMING
and watch how the prompt changes.
C user Florian programming grader.
Now we are in C users Flori programming, which cool. We've changed directories. Now, if you had a file in here that was called hello.py, you would do Python space hello.py enter, which would say run the Python command, the Python program, and give it the input hello.py, which is your script. And how that works exactly is something we'll cover later. But that is how commands usually work. Now, I had you install Git. And if we were to go and type Git at the command line right now, we get a whole bunch of output.
Usage Git version C less path greater C less name greater equals less value greater exec path equals less path greater HTML path man path info path p paginate p no pager no replace object there Git equals less path greater work tree equals less path greater.
Stop it there. That's essentially the program spitting out a help text. It's saying, look, you just called me, but you didn't actually tell me what to do. So I'm just going to list every single thing I can do for you. Look how helpful I am. And usually when you do that to a command, you'll either get the default behavior. If you run Python on its own, you're going to get an interactive interpreter, which means you can type lines of Python into it. And that can actually be useful for some things. For example, if you need to calculate how much money you need to pay, like for you're at a restaurant and you for some reason brought your computer with you.
Cricket titleman raised hand alert. Cricket titleman is lowered hand alert.
If you miss finger there, if you brought your computer with you to the restaurant, then you have to do the bill, and you for some reason didn't bring your phone. What you could do is run Python.
Python 3.10.2 /v3.10.2:50 Jan 1720.
It's going to give you a whole bunch of output, and now we have another prompt. We have a prompt
copyright credits or
that
license
just
for more information. Greater.
3 greater than signs, and that's going to be universal for every OS. And this means Python is listening to us. So let's see, we are with we want to order 5 steaks. Yeah, steak is $20. We can just do 20 star 5, and Python will helpfully tell us
100 greater.
There we go. You now have a calculator, and that is often where programming begins. It's computations. You compute new numbers. That doesn't mean you have to be a math whiz. Don't make that mistake. You don't have to know much more than basic math for most programming you'll be doing. It's going to mostly be logic. So is this true? Then do this. Is this true? Then do this other thing. But you're not going to need to know calculus or algebra or anything of those things unless you're doing things that involve those fields. So that's enough programming for the moment. I just threw a whole bunch of things at you, and I think I've spoken enough about the command line, so I'm going to pause here for just a couple of minutes for people to ask questions again. Just going to quickly look at the time.
7:37 p.m.
Yeah, we're nice on schedule.
Speech mode off.
You have one hand raised.
Okay. I guess go ahead. You may give them the speaking privilege.
It's Juan. I've given you permission.
Hello. So I have a question is that when I put CMD and put enter, so why don't the screen reader read out loud for me?
Are you on Nvda or JAWS?
I use JAWS. Yeah.
Okay. So when you run CMD and press enter, what exactly happens?
It just pop up the new window. So that's all. Yeah. So I cannot navigate on it.
That's strange. That may be a problem with your. Can you use the JAWS cursor to see if there's text there?
No. So can I demonstrate for you?
Yeah.
Just
sure.
A second. Okay. Let me. Yeah, that's I cannot navigate. Or maybe it's move the cursor, but it doesn't tell me.
You can't use the up and down arrow keys.
Yeah, I'm using now.
Right. So that's you're a little bit ahead of the class there. What's happening is it's trying to what you'll want to use in this case is your JAWS cursor to review the output. If you were to just type something and press enter, it will tell you automatically. But if you want to review your output, you need to use either the JAWS cursor for JAWS or the Nvda flat review keys for Nvda. And here's why. What you're currently trying to do and what your command line is trying to do is give you a command history. So if you use up and down arrow keys, you're going to go through the commands that you've run before. You haven't run any yet, so it's giving you a blank line.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it.
Could it also be an issue with the speech settings as far as what's verbalized in that window?
No.
Okay.
What's happening is if you press up and down arrow keys in the command line, it's not going to review the output.
Okay.
It's going to review the command history. And because Juan here hasn't run any commands yet, it's just going to give you a blank line because there is no history to look at. if you use the JAWS cursor, you can go through the actual output of the window. You cannot do that with the arrow keys. Okay.
Your next question is from Khalid.
Yeah, go ahead, Khalid.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep, hi. I'd like to check, can I use PowerShell or Bash, and what is the difference between CMD, PowerShell, and CMD? And just before you answer, just a quick comment to the previous question. There is a podcast, the last Freedom Scientific podcast, there is explanation of how to use the terminal with JAWS, the latest version of JAWS.
Is that Windows Terminal or the actual?
Yes, Windows Terminal. Windows Terminal.
Okay.
So that might be useful.
There's a couple of terms that were thrown out here, and I will quickly go over them. So Bash, CMD, and PowerShell are three different command line shells, if you will. And shell is essentially, well, what it sounds like. It's a wrapper around very similar functionality. CMD was the oldest one on Windows. CMD has been there since Windows 95. I'm pretty sure even before that, and is even from the MS-DOS days. So if you were to run Windows 98 and you would delete command.com, which was essentially CMD's grandpa, your entire system wouldn't boot. I speak from experience. I've done this as a kid. Bash is essentially the CMD equivalent of Linux. And Bash is being ported to Windows in various ways. There is Git Bash, which is essentially a thin Bash, just enough so you can get things done kind of version of Bash, where like you have a couple of tools, just enough to do Git stuff with, and then you can use that. There is also the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is essentially a lightweight Linux virtual machine that you can interact with from Windows. So you don't have to, if you want to do a dual boot system because you need Linux tools, you can do that without having to switch your OS over all the time. And there's various distributions that you can do that with, but that goes outside the scope of this session and maybe even this course. PowerShell is essentially CMD on steroids. So you can do much more powerful things with PowerShell, but it's also quite a bit more verbose and harder to learn. And it's generally backwards compatible with CMD. So I generally have people use CMD because it's just simpler and you don't really need PowerShell for the things we are going to be covering. But if you want to use PowerShell and want to learn about that, by all means, go for it. It's quite an interesting system. Does that answer your question, Khalid?
Yep. Thanks, and I'm sure I will have plenty more in the coming weeks.
That's what you're here for. That's what I'm here for. So,
thanks.
Yeah, sounds good. Time for one more. Is there more questions?
Oh, there's more. Alan?
Alan. You find the unmute. You may be muted, Alan.
You can hit Alt-A or hold your space bar down.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't realize the message had that in there. Yeah, I'm one of these newbie, never done any coding and stuff. But just to be clear, when you were demonstrating earlier and you typed bid in at the command line prompt, you were in the Windows command prompt area, not in Git, because Git's a command line interface too, right?
So when you say, like, it's the same with the Python example. So when I say Git, there's going to be a program on my computer that's going to respond to the name Git. And that's what you saw happen. I was in the Windows command line. I typed Git, and Git spat out its welcome greeting at us.
Right. Okay.
There is a Git Bash option in your start menu, which opens that Git Bash sort of minimal Bash environment that I was talking about earlier. So that's a
right. Okay. That was because I installed all that and I was running it and I thought, yeah, well, it just gives me it's like it's giving me a $sign on the screen. So I was saying, okay, that's just another command line thing. But
yeah.
Okay.
So that was a Git Bash probably.
Okay. Very great. Thanks.
Not a problem. All right. So this is a good segue because I just wanted to start talking about Git. So yay. Yeah. I'm gonna just move on for now.
Speech mode 7:40 Alan Lemley lower handler 7:45 p.m.
A lot of people
Speech mode
here, and I will not be able to answer all the questions. There is plenty of space on the Slido, so if you have questions after this class, absolutely put them there. I'd be happy to answer them. But Git, what is Git? And why do we cover it before we do any coding? Well, Git is essentially a tool that lets you do something called version control. And version control is very similar to what Dropbox does with snapshots, or with I think it's called revisions now, where you can have a file and you can have like a different version of that same file earlier in time. So if you make a mistake, you essentially just go back to an earlier version and you still have it. In VMware, that's called snapshots. And there's a lot of systems that essentially use this very similar technique. Like it's incremental backups essentially, but Git takes it a little bit further. So essentially what you do with Git is you create what's called a repository, or a repo for short. And a repo is essentially a central location where changes to files are stored. Not the files themselves, those are just there, and then the Git sort of encompasses it. And Git keeps track of changes, and that's pretty much all it does. But that simple concept is very powerful because it can do that in various different ways. Git lets you essentially make snapshots of your work. You can, like, essentially when you've written something, for example, if you're writing a novel and you've written a chapter, you can store that in Git. And theoretically speaking, there is no way for you to lose that chapter ever again if you have the repository, which you at this point will keep locally. So if you, for example, delete the file, you can get it back. If you overwrite the entire file with zeros, you can get it back. Now, that's what Git is for on a global level. Like, what can it do? It can do that. So it can make sure that you have a way to revert your document to an earlier state. It has a way for you to easily share a look at the differences between one version of a file and another. Although I must say that that is not the most accessible thing ever. It can be done, but it's a bit tedious, and it's something we will be covering in later sessions. And another thing it lets you do is called branching. Branching is essentially gamebook style programming. So you're at the crossroads. Are you going to turn left or are you going to turn right? You will make a branch that goes left, and then you write all the stuff that happens when you go left. And maybe someone else might write what happens when you turn right. And then you have two essentially different versions of the same file that do different things and are not in each other's way. You know, when like you're in Dropbox and you have conflicted copies happening because there's more and more people like working on the same file at the same time. Yeah, Git doesn't really do that until it does. And that's very cryptic, but we'll get to why that is in a second. This is where things like GitHub start coming in, because Git is something you can do for yourself. You can back up your own work. You can like have that, essentially that control of, oh, I just made a really cool thing and I don't want to break it, but I do want to experiment with what happens if I were to change this thing here. And if that happens, you make a snapshot, which is in Git called a commit. And then you can experiment to your heart's content. And if everything blows up, you can essentially just go back to that last commit or snapshot. And once you've done that, you can store it in the cloud, which is where GitHub comes in. GitHub is essentially hosting for your Git repository. So you can put your files plus your repository up on GitHub. And at that point, it's backed up. It's available to you from any computer that you want to access it to. And you can do that in a public way. So other people can see your code or your novel or your documentation or whatever have you. Or you can do that in a private way. So only you can see it, or people you invite to the repository can see it. And that's essentially where GitHub comes in. GitHub facilitates all that. And GitHub also lets you do that branching thing that I was just talking about with other people, Like if, for example, you want to work on something and someone else wants to work on that same thing, you can both work on them in different branches. And then once you're done with the branch, you do what's called a merge, which essentially says, I want to go back to the main path and I want to take all my changes with me and integrate those into the main path. And then if you do that, and this other person also does that, and there's not any conflicts, so you didn't touch the same line in the same file, then both of your branches will be merged into the main path. And at that point, you can make another branch if you want, but at that point, your branches are once again one path. And that is very powerful because it allows people to work and collaborate on something together, and is a big thing of how open source works. Generally, when you want to contribute to an open source project like Nvda, for example, you would clone the repository, which means download the current version that's on GitHub to my machine. Then you could create a branch for a new feature. Say, for example, you want to teach Nvda how to speak Klingon, you could make a teach Nvda Klingon branch. And then you can work in exclusion. You're not going to touch anything or break anything. And then once you're happy with your changes, you make what's called a pull request, which is essentially a bit of a misnomer. It's more of a merge request where you say, hey, I have all these changes that I made, and now I want you to merge them in because they're super awesome and I think they'll really contribute to the product. And then the people at Nvda can be like, well, this is cool, but you should change this and this thing before we can merge it. And at that point, you have a discussion on GitHub where you essentially can get reviews from other people on your code, and you can either listen to those or you cannot and decide, well, this is not going to work. But the idea is obviously that you listen to the feedback, you incorporate the feedback, and at some point your changes become part of the product, and you'll always be in the history. Like, people can always look up that you were the person who taught Nvda Klingon. And hey, if you want to be famous for that, then there you go. This can be used for various things. Like if you want to, for example, write a novel, like I said, you can put it on GitHub if you do it in text, or if you want to write programming code, you can experiment without losing your changes. Like you can save it, you can save the file in various different ways if you do it in a branch, and then it's not going to touch the working copy. And that is a very powerful thing that a lot of people will expect you to understand. And I'm almost done. I know there's a lot of terminology here, and we're going to take a bit of a longer pause in just a moment to answer questions, because I'm sure there's many of them. But the last term you have to learn is the term fork. And a fork is something you'll have probably seen on GitHub if you've ever been on GitHub. A fork is a branch on steroids. Essentially what that is you made Nvda learn Klingon, and Nvda's contributors are like, you know what, this is terrible. You shouldn't have done that. We don't want this to be part of core. At that point, you can decide, I'm going to make a fork, which means I'm going to make a copy of the current state of the Nvda repository, and it's going to be mine to maintain from then on forward. And you do have to credit the original source when you do that. GitHub does that for you. It'll say, okay, this project is forked from so-and-so. People can just click through to the original. But at that point, you have detached your work from the actual Nvda code base, and you can merge it back in. You can make a pull request across forks, but you don't have to. And at that point, this is where, for example, what's a good example? So Nvda has actually done this for the Japanese version of Nvda, and there's a reason for that. The way Japanese works is fundamentally different to a lot of other languages, and they'd have to do a lot of changes just to make Nvda work. And Nvda have decided that it would be better to only have those changes in the Japanese version, because they wouldn't make sense in any other version. So there is a fork of NVDA called NVDA JP, which has those forks, and those are has those functions, and those are maintained by other people, and they will keep them in sync. So if there's a new version of NVDA, there will soon be a new version of NVDA JP, and they are in communication, but they're not the same product. And that is how a lot of open source development works. If, for example, someone puts a repository on maintenance mode or says, I'm not going to develop this anymore, someone can fork, a lot of someone, like a bunch of people can fork it actually. And then someone will come out as the new maintainer of the most popular fork of that project. And that'll happen to NVDA add-ons, that'll happen to any programming project, really, even documentation project, that happens. And this idea of forking a project, and this is why I'm telling you all this, the idea of forking a project and pull requesting across forks is how a lot of coding teaching tools require you to do your homework. So if there is someone who's checking your work, what they'll often tell you to do is clone this repository here, make the changes that the assignment tells you to make, and then make a pull request to the original fork. And then someone checks over your work and see the differences between where you started and when you finished and give you feedback on that. And this is where we come back to what I said in the beginning of this class. I'll teach you how to code, but I'll also teach you how to learn how to code. And this is one of the fundamental things that you'll now and again run into when you're looking at mainstream course work. And now I'm going to open the floor for a whole bunch of no doubt questions.
Okay, your first question is from Jacob.
Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
Just a really quick question. So just to confirm if I understand this correctly, basically a branch is just the whole copy of the codes in the repository. And if I branch it out, I can play with it, do whatever I want to it without affecting other things on the project. But basically, it's just the full copy of the thing.
Yes, and this is where it gets a little conceptual. Essentially, when you make a branch, all your changes to the files are stored in that branch.
Right.
So when you leave the branch, all those changes are undone immediately.
Okay.
So then if you go back in the branch, they'll be reapplied. So essentially Git keeps track of the changes from the point where you branched off.
Okay,
so,
perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty much a copy. You're correct.
Right.
Next question.
The next is from Semrawit, and I probably said your name terrible.
You may be muted. We cannot currently hear you if you're speaking.
Oh, try it again. Hold down your space bar. I heard you for a second.
Yeah, we heard you breathe. Oh, there you are.
Okay. Oh, I heard a lot of terminologies that I'm not familiar. I mean, I'm very, very new to the programming. So I'm just wondering in future if you could be able to, give us the list of major terms so that maybe we can research them, or if you could try to define them. For example, I don't know what NVDA clinging on, whatever that was. So yeah.
Yeah, that was a cultural note. I will put the terms that I've used today in a handout. So it's going to be in the video description of the video that's about to go up. I will also put that in the Slido. But it's good feedback for us to essentially have that list before the session starts. So I'll definitely keep that in mind. Thank you for that feedback.
On that same note, this is Ty speaking. I just wanted to acknowledge that there are many levels of users on this call right now, and I know that some people are feeling lost and discouraged. I want to encourage you to hang on. We're going to try to address as many questions as we can from introductory users and introductory users, because there's many levels of introductory coding. So I'm aware of that. I don't want you to feel discouraged. We're going to try to get to all that as we can as we move forward.
Yep. I'm, like I said, I'm pausing here for a very deliberate reason. I threw a lot of terms at you, and I really understand how this may not quite have sunken in yet. If you're feeling a bit lost, that's completely all right. This is going to become more tangible as we work with it. This is more meant as like a sort of a really like quick introduction to what Git is and how it works. You're not like supposed to completely understand how it works at this point or be able to apply it. That's going to come in subsequent sessions. Also to address.
Oops, sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to say thank you to our sponsor, CDW. I'm trying to make sure we do that every hour. So thank you so much for your support of our program.
Okay. So the to address the question, Klingon is a fictitious language from the Star Trek universe. So that was just me geeking out a little bit. So I was essentially saying you could make a feature in Nvda, which is a screen reader, to teach it to speak that Star Trek language. So that was essentially just the cultural note that I made. It's not relevant for the actual course. It's just an example. So you didn't miss anything if you didn't get that reference.
Florian, can I launch a poll really fast?
Sure. What about that?
What I really want to check is our audience. We've got quite a few that are really not sure even what to ask because they are really lost. This gives us an idea of if we need an introduction to the introduction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I did launch. I'm going to launch a poll, and if you can't access the poll, feel free to drop it in the chat. It's okay. I'm really asking, are we moving right along and you're understanding where we're at? Are you understanding, but at the beginning level? Are you not understanding and you know you need some help, or I need an introduction to this introduction? Because our goal is to help and support. And it's okay if you need an introduction to this introduction. It means we probably need to build another course for you, and that's what we would work on. It just gives us an idea of who's here with us right now.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give an example of how all this works in a more practical sense, so people can get a bit more of like an actual demo of how this works in just a moment when we've covered some more questions. So that is going to happen, and that is probably going to be the one, the thing we're going to also like mostly end off with. But yeah, there is a demo coming. So this is not just going to be a whole bunch of theory.
8 participants raised hand alert.
Okay, we've hit a little bit about 60%. So I'm going to end it just so that we know about what we have. So you've got 47% moving right along, understand. 40% understand, but I'm at the beginning level. 3, they're not understanding, need some help. And then we've got about 10% who need an introduction to the introduction. So just realize that there's some of you that are struggling more than others, and we will work on that.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's completely all right if you don't get all this just yet. This is not going to be a test. I'm not going to like fail you from the class if you don't quite get this yet. And this is tricky for even seasoned coders because Git is a relatively new concept if we look at like the last 100 years. And there are companies out there that don't do it at all. And there is a whole bunch of people who do use it. And it is the general considered best practice to work with it. So it is something that people are still coming to grips with. And if you're completely lost, that is completely understandable.
Over my head. Meeting controls
now,
see Windows System 32, see Windows System 32 CMD.
And I know I was being talked over there by my screen reader. What I will quickly do is I will show off how this works.
Jerry Fiedler is lowered hand alert.
And it's going to be very simple. It's going to actually what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show off
when Wayfisher is lowered hand alert.
Jakob's question from earlier. He asked me if is a branch essentially a copy of the code, and how does that work? So we're going to quickly show that.
Everyone. Can you log in with Git from the command line as alert?
Yes, you can log in with Git from the command line. You're going to have to at some point, because when you communicate with GitHub, it wants your account, and it's going to ask you for a username and password. But that's beyond the scope of this first session.
6 participants raised hand alert.
All right. So I'm going to quickly run through the concepts of it. Don't worry about the commands. We'll be covering those later. I'm just going to show the effects of the commands, rather.
Initialize empty Git repository in C/user/Flory/programming/Git/C user Flory.
So I've just written git init, and again, this will be in the notes that I will be putting out. But I just ran git init, which makes a new repository in the current folder, and we are still in this programming folder from earlier.
C user Flory programming grader.
Now, if I make a file called hello,
TOUCH_AELLOLEXT C user Flory programming grader,
and we open that in Notepad, so we're going to open that
run dialog open combo box
file in Notepad.
G tag folder view list recite programming window preview items view hello.txt 2 of 2 hello.txt notepad text editor edit multi-line blank.
So we have an empty file here with Notepad. There's nothing in this file. I'm going to type the word hello and save it. The file is now saved to my computer,
programming
but not yet to Git. If I now do git status,
Git status branch master, no commits yet, untracked files, use Git add list file grader to include what will be committed, hello.txt, nothing added to commit, untracked files present, use Git add to track, C user Flory programming.
So it's telling me there are modified files in this folder, but they're not being tracked. And to fix that, you do git
from add to everyone. When the video goes up on YouTube, what channel will I find it on? I mean the channel name, thanks alert. Add space.
File name. So in this case, hello.txt.
Hello.txt. C user Flory programming grader.
You get no output, which means everything is fine. Now this commit that I mentioned before comes in. So we have essentially
to everyone. I pause chat alert.
We've essentially told Git, I want you to keep an eye on this file because it's going to change, and I want you to keep track of those changes. And now and again, I want those changes to be snapshotted. In this case, it's called committed. So I will do git.
commit space dash.
The command again doesn't really matter at this point. I'm just showing off how it works. So I'm going to call this the
initials commit quote master root commit 32F047 initial commit 1 file change 1 insertion plus create mode 100,644 hello.txt C user Flory programming.
So that's a really long-winded way to tell us, okay, what I've captured is that you made a file and you added a line to it, which is correct. Now I'm going to go back to this file.
Hello.txt notepad text editor edit multi-line blank. Hello.
Has the word hello in it. I'm going to remove that hello.
Hello selected. Blank selection removed.
And save it.
Blank.
The file is now empty.
Blank.
And if we go back to the command line,
C Windows system.
And git status again.
Git space STATUS. On branch master changes not staged for commit. Use Git add list file grader to update what will be committed. Use Git restore list file grader to start changes in working directory. Modified. Hello.txt. No changes added to commit. Use.
So it says there are changes that are not in a commit. If you want to add them, you use the git add command. And we don't want to do that yet because I didn't mean to remove that word. Oh no, my work is gone. So what I can do now is I can say I want to go back to the state I was in before. Checkout again. Command doesn't matter right now, just the effect.
Already on master hello.txt C user Flory programming grader. Hello.blank. C Windows system.
And I can do git
space reset. On stage changes after reset hello.txt C user Flory programming grader. Hello.blank. C Windows system.
I don't know how to use git.
Git space reset -AR D head is now 32F047 initial commit C user Flory programming grader.
And now if we go back to the file.
Hello.t blank. Undo hello unselected. Blank. Hello.
It's not quite working.
Windows
of course, this is live, so
user Flory programming grader.
This would of course happen. I remember what I did wrong now. So
hello.
File is empty. I want the file to be empty, and we'll save it. What I actually needed to do is checkout and the file name.
hello.
And that reverts it to the last committed version. So right now the file is empty. I'm going to go back to the first committed version.
Updated one path from the index. C user Florian programming grader.
And now if I go back,
hello.txt blank.
Notepad is not understanding that the file changed, but take it from me. It did actually revert my change. Again, life. But that is how it works. You can get your stuff back. And if I were to make a branch, which involves another couple of commands, I could, for example, make the word be high or yodel-a-doodle, doesn't really matter. And then if I am not happy with that change, I can revert it, or I can just delete that branch and go back to main, to my master branch, which is often called either master or main. And my changes will be undone, and I'll have the pristine copy before I made that branch. So that is a practical example of how it works. Again, if you're not quite following along, that's completely fine.
11 p.m.
And what I'm going to be doing next, before we take it to questions to end off the session, is I'm going to do a little bit of coding. And I'm going to show you just how simple at times it can be to just write a bit of code and automate things. Like, for example, there are resources out there on the web that lets you automate things, and those are really useful. I'm going to show you how this works, and then as homework for next week, at least part of it, is going to be look at the file and give me your best theory on exactly how it works. Like I said, I'm going to run it, so you're going to see how it works. You're going to see what it does, but not exactly maybe how it works and why it does the things it does. And that's for you to detective out for next week. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to use Notepad for the moment because VS Code, while it is a very powerful piece of kit, does add quite a bit of complexity to the workflow that we don't quite need just yet. So I'm going to go back to my file, actually.
Meeting controls. Program C, Windows System 32 CMD external C, user Florian programming grader.
Actually, I might just make a new file. We'll make a file live.py. Oh, I need to not talk over the speech. Just use the command line commands to create a new file. And we're going to open that on Notepad.
Programming. Text on the programming window. Items view list. Hello.txt not selected 2 of 3. Live.py 3 of 3.
Live.py because we're live and it's probably going to break, but that's part of coding.
Share with Skype. Move to OneDrive M. 7 zip. Edit with Notepad. Send with transfer. Edit with Notepad ++N. Programming window. Items view list. C user Florian programming live.py Notepad ++ Notepad blank.
Okay, so I use Notepad++ because that was just quicker from the context menu. There's no actual difference in this case. So I'm going to start programming. And
8:13 p.m.
I'm going to make sure the screen reader is on so you can hear what I'm typing.
Run dot selection remove folder view list.
Do that. I'm gonna quickly
Florian Beijers window.
Fix
never.mp
super tiny thing. There we go.
C user Florian programming lib access Academy American printing C programming.
Access a file with this script, and I want that file to be in the same folder to not add unnecessary complexity.
C user Florian program C Windows System 32 meeting controls. C user Florian programming lib C user Florian programming lib blank.
Here's our file. Blank. I'm going to just type some Python code. And I'm going to turn off character by character reading. Actually, no, I'm going to turn on word reading and character reading so you can hear exactly what's being typed.
Speak command keys on. Nvda speak type words off. Speak type characters off.
Look at that. It already was set to that. Great. So
blank. IMPORT import space. TIME time. Import time blank. IMPORT import space. OS PRINT print left parent. Quote. HELLO. Hello dot space. LET let us space COUNT count space DON. Down quote right parent. COUNTER counter space equals space 10 10 counter equals 10 blank. WHILE while space COUNTER counter space greater space 0 0 colon while counter greater 0. Blank. P R R P space 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 P R I N T. Print left parent. S T R S T R left parent. C O U N T E R counter right parent space plus space quote E L E P H A N T S elephants bang quote right parent. C O U N T E R counter space dash equals space 1 1 counter equals 1 O C space 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 print str counter plus L N I R P space 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 blank space counter equals 1 blank counter equals blank O S us dot S T A R T F I L E start file left parent quote N E V E R never dot M P 3 MP3 quote right parent us dot start file never dot MP3 blank.
All right. So that was just a little bit of coding in Notepad++. So when you do this in VS Code, what will happen is you'll get a bunch of autocomplete suggestions and all sorts of other things that are really helpful when you know what you're doing, but can get a little confusing once once you're just learning and figuring out how things work. So what I'm going to do now is going to see if I made any mistakes, and I do that by doing exactly what I said earlier. I'm going to give this file to Python.
Programming. C Windows System 32 C Windows System 32 CMD.X terminal C user Florian programming grader. P Y T H O N Python space L I V E live dot E Y file C user Florian programming live dot py line 8 counter equals 1 indentation error unexpected indent C user Florian programming grader.
So this is an example of a bug, and this time it's called a compile time bug. I have made a mistake, and it says what I have done wrong. It tells me that on line 8 I made an indentation error, which essentially means that either I put too many spaces or I put too few.
Import time.
And we're going to look at line 8.
Import blank. Print hello counter equals 1 counter print str counter equals 1.
This is line 8.
Space space blank. Space 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 space. C
and what's happened here is actually a really good example of how your tools can fight you. So Notepad++ does have rudimentary support for programming languages, and what it has done here that I didn't expect, and that Nvda did not tell me about, is it's indented this line too far. Because when I pressed enter, there was already indentation there, but I didn't check for it. So now I have a line that's too far indented. And Python is one of the few programming languages that actually crashes when you do that.
Space.
This is a thing that is enforced. Normally in programming languages, when you write code,
space blank.
Your colleagues will crash when you don't indent your code.
Space.
But Python does it for you.
Space.
So now I fixed that mistake.
C Windows System 32 CMD.X terminal C users 7 participants raised hand alert. C Windows System 32 CMD.X nail error lowered hand alert. C Windows C users Florian programming grader Python live dot Python live dot hello let Brew music. Brew music window sign in. C Windows System 32 CMD.X terminal C users Florian programming grader. C users Florian programming grader.
Now, that went a little fast.
C users Florian.
What it did is
counter equals print str counter plus elephant counter greater 0
extra line
print str counter plus elephants
to make it a bit more clear what just happened, because I did not have the chance to really tell us.
Quote right parent blank.
And after that, well, we have time for questions. So
time SLEE sleep left parent 1 right parent.
There, I added one line.
C Windows System 32 CMD.X terminal C users Florian programming grader.
Break.
C hello let us count down 10 elephants 9 elephants 8 elephants 7 elephants 6 elephants 5 elephants 4 elephants 3 elephants 2 elephants 1 elephant. Brew music window sign in the Florian features my music list album selected.
And I just
Windows System 32 CMD.
And with that, we have come to the end of this first demo, and essentially there is now time for questions.
Okay, your first question is from Michael.
Michael, go ahead.
So I don't know if you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, quick question. And this was brought up earlier. When you're coding, would you recommend that you put your screen reader to read at a certain level, beginner, intermediate, or advanced, and especially for folks like me who are new to this?
It doesn't really matter. Beginner, like those levels are mostly for how much hints you get for using components, not so much how much JAWS
reads
where like code is concerned. What you may want to play with is the punctuation levels. So if you want to hear your brackets and your parens, you may want to like look into JAWS's punctuation reading verbosity to make sure that it reads everything you want it to read. I know where they're supposed to be. And when they're not there, I'll get an error. So I'm at a level where I don't really need to do that. And I can also use braille so I can cheat. But if that is something you feel comfortable doing, then absolutely, yes, you can do that.
Okay, your next question is from Brian.
Brian, go for it.
7 participants raised hand alert. Michael has lowered hand alert.
Brian Yamada.
Okay, testing. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm currently in a vocational rehab school learning everything. Just trying to, I had to go between use my tablet. But anyways, I'll get back to my questions. My questions are really more fundamental. For some reason, I don't think I got on until 7 minutes. So you probably have addressed this. I do have more technical questions, but will you be sending an email summary, for example? I heard you talking about Slido. I touched that link, but I think I've never heard of Slido before. All I was when I reviewed the emails, we were just supposed to install a Git. So in regards to, I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to. I could literally spend here, and I think a lot of other students could spend 30 minutes asking questions. So contact. Slido is like Discord or like a social media. How do we contact you? Are there instructions from the link that you gave us on how to set it up in relationship to you specifically or this class specifically? And second question, also a communication question, will you be sending a summary email? Like I'm doing the best to take notes, but there's a lot of alien language here, which kind of you addressed. I'm one of those ones who requested an introduction to the introduction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
All right. So let me stop you there and answer your questions. Just like for time's sake. Yes, a Slido, you don't need to install Slido. So essentially, I picked Slido because it's a very low threshold platform. Essentially, there's just a box that has you type your question. And then there is a box that you can type your name in if you want to. If you don't want to, if you want to be anonymous and, just hide behind the internet, you can absolutely do that. And if you do want to put your name or your email so you can be reached, that's completely fine as well. But you don't have to do any of that. Really, the only thing you need to do is you go to the page. There's going to be ask a question to the speaker edit box. And you just type your question there and it's going to reach me. You don't need to install anything. You don't need to set anything up. That's all you do. And I think you can use it from literally any device ever.
Okay, very good. That's what I was hoping the answer would be. And as far as I know, we have Leanne Gilbert's email. I am really a little bit confused on how, can we contact you? I don't know if this is like a charity or if it's like a job. I know you have your primary job, but can we even ask you questions directly? Was that covered at the beginning of the video?
So Slido essentially is that, because I check that several times a day and I will respond when I see a question come in. What I did mention about Slido is that it doesn't notify me when there's a question and you won't get notified if there's an answer. So when you put your question in, I will see it, I'll get to it and I'll answer it, but it may not happen within 5 minutes of you posting. It's not instant messenger. I don't see when you do it right away. And as for the summary email, what I will do on Slido is I will make a question with the link. I will just say, hey, this is a summary. Can you give me a summary? And I'll give you a link to the summary. The link will also be in the description of the video on the APH YouTube channel. So there's 2 places where you can get it. If it gets lost in the spam, it'll be on the YouTube video. And I will think about a better way to disseminate that. Maybe I will put it in the preparatory email for next session as well. So there's going to be a summary and I'm going to give a glossary of all the terms. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you. And just to finalize, it's going to be in the Linux playlist in the APH YouTube homepage. Just look for a Linux playlist. All these videos.
That's a question for Leanne. I don't know where they're going to put it. I think this is going to be its own playlist.
It's going to be the name of this class in a playlist, I assume.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Okay, the next person is Zachary.
Okay, Zachary, go for it.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
Just one quick thing. You were talking about the GitHub thing. Like for example, if you decide to create a new branch with a new issue, are you supposed to like name the branches, or what would be like good naming conventions?
It depends on the product and the project. Usually you can look at the branches that are on GitHub to get an idea, but usually if you work with an issue tracker, for example, Jira is a very popular one, you will have a number for the story that you're working on, and that'll be the first part of the branch. So it would be like branch 1234 -fix -bug or something like that. And then people can see, oh, that's the branch for that story, 1234. But it depends on the project. Honestly, it depends.
Okay, thank you. Or like if you want to experiment, then you just like create a new branch, like change of XXX, whatever.
Yeah, add this, remove that, change this. Yeah. Usually a succinct summary of what you're trying to do or what you're intending to do for like a note for yourself or other contributors.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not a problem.
Okay, next question is Kundan Kumar.
Zachary Morse has lower tab alert.
Kundan
Kumar. Cannot currently hear you, Mr. Kumar.
Alt A or hold the space bar down. Okay, come back. Our next hand is Abdullah Nimir. I think so.
Yep, go ahead, Abdullah.
Test. Am I audible or is it not?
You're a bit quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay, sorry for that. It's just a suggestion. It's not really a question. It's more of a suggestion. I think that you should write like a kind of a little booklet of all the terms that you will use during the course.
7 participants raised hand alert.
Like I think you should.
Zachary Morse has lowered hand alert.
Among the people, so that.
Hey, I'm really sorry, but I want to make sure the captioner can get what you're saying. Are you able to get closer to your microphone or change your volume in any way or something like that so that we can hear your question?
I can give a quick summary of what the question was, because I think I get the gist of it.
Thank you.
What Abdullah asked was, or suggested rather, was that it would be a good idea to make a little booklet or a glossary of the terms that I will be using in the coming sessions. And that's been raised a couple of times during the session already. So I'm definitely going to be doing that going forward. I will probably put up a GitHub page with a list of terms that I will add to as I think of them. So you can like look at those to essentially understand what a term means. So yeah, that's definitely something I've heard. And thank you so much for that feedback. I'll definitely keep that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
8:28 p.m. 8:28 p.m.
We are at our time to end. Is there any closing information you want to give? And the reminders to those with their hands raised to use the Slido to drop your questions in there.
If you have questions, absolutely put them in Slido. I will go through them, and I will definitely answer them. And the summary with the link to the glossary is coming. I will hopefully get that out later today and put it on the Slido as well.
Can you spell Slido for me, please?
It's SLIDO, but there's a link in the email that you got.
Okay, thanks.
Prepare for this course. At the very bottom, there's a link that says, if you want to ask questions, click here. And that's where you go. And then there's literally just a field where you answer your question. It's super simple.
Thanks again to everyone for coming. And I want to say thank you again to our sponsor, CDW. And I will turn it over to Leanne again. She had another comment.